welcome to the most recent installment of the Barksdale Bubble Podcast. I am meteorologist Caroline Kestora, joined by
meteorologist Brian Fowler. Live this time. I was live from the firehouse up there in Plain Dealing, where I volunteered last time. I was up in our conference room. This is my first time here in studio. Ever for this podcast, so it's pretty cool.
Yeah, happy to have you in person. And we are joined by meteorologist Ryan Knapp, hurricane enthusiast. He's also a local meteorologist here in Shreveport as well at the National Weather Service. And we're just going to talk all about hurricanes. Ryan, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, of course. It's a pleasure being here.
June, just around the corner.
Soon.
Hurricane season, right there. We're all thinking about it, wondering, so what is it going to be like this year? And you hear about, every year they put out the new list, and every year the insurance rates on the coast end up going up because of that too. So I'm sure the folks on the coast are going, all right, what are they going to say this time? Is it going to go up? Because it never seems to go down. It seems to always be, it's going to be a big season this go around.
And I think that's one of the nice parts with the overall forecast being in such a range is the fact that you kind of get into all right, well, is it going to be on the higher side? Is it going to be on the lower side? And as obviously the season goes on, that forecast becomes a little bit more, dialed in, I guess, and to kind of get an ultimate picture as to what the overall trend is looking like as we get towards, say, like the peak of the hurricane season, towards like, say, August, September, and October.
Yeah.
Well, and people say, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's interesting here in the Arklatex because we're not coastal, but we can get impacts from hurricanes. Everybody knows someone who lives down at the coast in Louisiana or other parts of the Gulf, and so it matters. Even if you're not directly impacted in any sort of way, it's pretty interesting to kind of see what's going on, I think.
And while we're not coastal now, we were thousands of years ago, but this day and age, the beach is a little bit further away. A lot of folks say, how can they possibly forecast hurricane season, a season when meteorologists can't go out 7 days? I can't, of course. So can Caroline, but a lot of others in other places and such. But what would your answer be to that?
Well, I mean, we were just talking about that even before the podcast started about how some of our internal outlooks were starting all the way back in March. So we were talking about, looking at the various climate signals as we head towards the hurricane season, especially looking more at, say, what phase of ENSO we're in, El Nino, La Nina. That's kind of the big buzzword around hurricanes. So starting even all the way back into, say, February and March, you kind of get an early indication as to what that time period is looking like, typically looking at like 3-month averages, so to speak, to kind of really open up the sample pool of what the environment, what the overall, synoptic conditions are looking like as we head towards the hurricane season. So really as early as about March, but once you get closer to about May, I would say, if you wanted to kind of compare it to, say, like spring training, okay, spring is, or, May is really the part where like the team starts showing up for spring training games. We're getting close to the start of the season and moving on kind of from there.
And it's not like you just go out and forecast and say, well, Florida's going to see a hurricane in July. I mean, obviously you could say that. It might come true just given how probability works and stuff like that. But what are certain things that you look for when it comes to forecasting in advance, like starting in March? You're looking for patterns. You're not necessarily looking for, well, there's going to be a Category 5 hurricane rolling through the Gulf very, very soon. So what goes into it? Because I feel like that's something that's interesting, especially for people who don't really forecast hurricanes or look into that stuff.
Yeah, you really look on more of the kind of global scale to start. Like I said, those teleconnections, the big one obviously starting with El Nino or La Nina. Right. Last year we were in La Nina, which as a result was kind of the main driving point of why the forecast for last year was so hyperactive to start. You obviously saw the hurricane forecast numbers last year. We're talking, 30 plus storms being possible. That's kind of the first thing meteorologists look at, especially those who are forecasting tropical activity. For this upcoming season, it gets a little bit more trickier. We're not exactly looking at a La Nina, so to speak. We're looking more at kind of what's called an ENSO neutral phase. We're kind of right in the middle, kind of right on the border there of both. And there's two phases to that. There's the warm phase and the cool phase. And we're kind of lingering closer towards that cool phase, which means we could see some La Nina-like tendencies in the forecast this season, which is why with the new forecast numbers coming out for this season, you're seeing them lingering closer to average to maybe slightly above average for this upcoming season. So with those La Nina-like conditions, you can get the warmer waters in the Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, and the Atlantic, but you also see a reduction in shear across the Western Caribbean and the Gulf as well, which can obviously help hurricanes form.
Did the Saharan dust coming in from Africa, did that hinder development last year at all?
Yeah, Saharan dust was actually a big thing last year. There's some other kind of small, what I would say, synoptic scale and mesoscale kind of patterns that allowed for storms, or at least the African easterly waves that we look for those long track hurricanes, to come up a little bit further north off of the coast of Africa compared to where they were last year. Something called the African monsoon trough was a little bit further north last year than what it was typically on the climatological average, I would say. And what that ultimately did was allow for those waves to come off of Africa and kind of clash with that dry air quicker than what they would be. But obviously that's something that is a big player every single year. We talk about, oh, look at this wave coming off of Africa, and then there's a giant plume of dry air, and then ultimately it just never forms from there.
Yeah, so you mentioned the season outlook, and those numbers actually came out this morning. So if you want to go ahead and put up the numbers so people can see, this is the 2025 Hurricane Center's Hurricane Outlook, whatever you want to officially call it, but it's important. It came out this morning, and so I just want to throw out a few numbers before we talk about specifics for 2025. So the 30-year average for the Atlantic shows 14 named storms usually. That includes 7 hurricanes and 3 major hurricanes. Now 2024 had 18 named storms, 11 hurricanes, and 5 major hurricanes. And you heard Ryan say they're leaning above average. This is the outlook. They give a range. So what are you guys thinking?
It's definitely, I would say, the bounds for the higher side are definitely kind of in line with what a lot of forecasters were calling for, even kind of closer to that, Colorado State forecast. What'll be really interesting to see, especially those higher numbers, is there's a lot of talk about different types of teleconnections across the Atlantic that may allow for the main development region maybe be a little bit cooler than normal. So that's something we'll have to see on a sea surface temperature perspective, but regardless, still leaning above average as we head through this kind of neutral period.
That's incredible. We sit there and we're kind of watching everything. When you say we're in that neutral positioning right now, essentially we will just have kind of an average. We could have an average year come hurricane season.
Yeah, it's definitely possible we see numbers towards average. And in fact, if you look at some of the more defined forecast out there, they are close to that 14, 7, and 3 values that Caroline mentioned. So that is typical when you look at more neutral seasons, but it's going to be really interesting to see, especially being in that cool phase. You can kind of get those La Nina-like tendencies sometimes, which can allow for an increase in storm development. One other thing that is talked about is obviously high pressure across the central Atlantic. That's kind of the big driver as to why those waves move west. A lot of the preseason outlooks, a lot of the climate models were showing that high pressure maybe a little bit displaced off to the northeast this year, and in return would allow for a little bit more of a recurve into the central Atlantic. And with warmer waters kind of co-located a little bit further north in the Atlantic this year, it's definitely possible for those what we call kind of like those ham sandwich storms, which can just kind of linger across the central Atlantic for a while.
I've never heard that.
And just sit there and kind of rack up what we call ACE points, or accumulated cyclone energy. So, those storms, while they may recurve out into the central Atlantic, may allow for a busier season. It does keep maybe some of the impacts a little bit further away from
further east
from the continental U.S. But like I said, with shear maybe being a little bit less across the Western Caribbean, we have to also watch for homegrown systems as well, which are those storms that form in the Western Caribbean and into the Gulf, and then quickly, impact the U.S. or Mexico in some form of capacity.
And then some of those will linger right around the coast, and they'll just basically hug the coastline.
Yep.
For a week or so, and head out to Florida, and then make a U-turn, come back into the Gulf. I've seen that.
Yeah,
We didn't
absolutely.
have any of those
Absolutely
last year,
incredible.
though. There weren't really any twisty, turny
No.
storms last year. I would say they all had pretty straight tracks for the most part.
I think the one thing, at least that's on everyone's mind, especially across the Arctic, was Beryl last year, obviously being one of the bigger impacts here locally. We also had Francine down in New Orleans last year, which didn't really impact the Arctic all that much, but it was really Beryl. That was kind of the big talking point, considering the fact that last season was one of the slowest starts on record, believe it or not, compared to where we actually finished.
Yeah, because the first named storm was June 20th, and I don't know how that compares on average, but it did feel like it took some time to get going, and then we reached July, I think it was 7th or 8th for Beryl, and we felt the impacts from it. It made landfall out towards Houston, but it moved through. I think it had weakened to a tropical storm status as it rolled through the Arctic, but that didn't really matter.
Yeah, no, it didn't matter at all. And you have Beryl, you go through July, you go into August, you go to September, and the waters are getting warmer and warmer. The hurricane season becomes more active, and a lot of people ask, they go, why is it even during October when it's getting cooler around here, hurricane season is still so active?
Yeah.
And what's the best way that you describe that? I tell people it's kind of like having a pool. You know, in the summertime, the pool's nice and hot. You get a cold front move through, gets a little chilly, but that water might still be swimmable for a little while longer. It's going to take a lot longer for that water to cool down than it is for the land.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you pretty much nailed it there. You know, as we move through the later parts of the year, you also get a little bit more interaction with shear. Shear really increases across the basin as you start to get later into the year. So, you know, ultimately the season starts to kind of wean off as we move towards the end of November. You know, hopefully we don't have a December or January event like we had a few years ago. Yeah, no kidding.
But
yeah, it's close. But you know, it's definitely the August, September, October period that we really watch for. And as we kind of talked about with Barrel, you know, given the fact that it was such a slow start last year, and then Barrel developed, became one of the earliest Cat 5s on record, which kind of blew everyone away. We're like, okay, you know what? We started slow, but maybe the season will actually verify how the forecast we're calling for.
Yeah, I remember watching Barrel get to Category 5 strength. It was crazy because it was my first, I would say, more active hurricane season to kind of forecast myself, and just seeing how that unfolded and watching the rapid intensification, which is always so interesting, the different stages of forecasting hurricanes once they do form and what goes into it, because it's not as easy as the storms that we forecast here on a weekly basis. It's not, oh, well, this model shows this, and so probably going to get some storms rolling through. There's a lot that goes into forecasting hurricanes. And so what goes into forecasting those crazy little turns or rapid intensification phases when it comes to different types of storms?
Well, there's a couple things. Obviously, we have our global models. You see those on TV. You know, you'll see people on social media post one run of the GFS out to 300 hours. But there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes that includes the men and women of the NOAA Hurricane Hunters, the Air Force Hurricane Hunters. We also got to talk about any time that there is a storm in the Western Caribbean or in the Gulf of Mexico. You also have a situation where weather forecast offices, our office as well, we do multiple weather balloon launches a day. So typically we do 2 launches a day. But when we have a storm potentially impacting somewhere in the Caribbean or along the Gulf, we bump that up to 4 launches a day during each kind of hour. So it depends really what time of the year we're at, but it would be around 6 a.m., 6 p.m., and then kind of recycle that normally for the two regular, but then one also in noon and around midnight. So those balloon launches, the data from those balloon launches go into the models, which help forecasters at the Hurricane Center ultimately determine steering patterns aloft. So, you know, the high pressure and the ridges aloft to help understand the steering patterns. And then also, like I said, the men and women of the Hurricane Hunters, both on the Air Force side and the NOAA side, flying into those storms and then even flying above those storms to ultimately get a handle on how strong those storms are, and then as well steering patterns.
So Hurricane Hunters fascinating to me. The reason they do what they do is it's harder to get observations for hurricanes because there's no observation sites all over the ocean. For us here, we have a bunch of different airport sites and different things.
Weather watchers, and we don't have weather watchers out in the middle of the ocean.
I'm sure if we asked, we could find someone with a boat.
If you can figure that out, let me know, because I'd be curious to meet them. That's a very interesting gig to get them there.
I'll send a message.
And you know, the C-130s going up, the Hurricane Hunters. I've got my daughter's godfather. He was part of all of that for many years. I think he ended up moving out and his rank went up, and then he ended up going somewhere else. But he was doing the hurricane hunting, the C-130s, and going up in one of those aircraft in the middle of a storm has to be just an amazing thing. Because you're normally when you fly, you want to avoid storms.
Yeah.
And now you're going into a mega storm that has multiple other storms embedded in it. You're getting tremendous wind shear and everything else, including hail. You're out in the middle of the ocean. These guys, how in the world are they concentrating up in that plane they have all their equipment, and they're trying to focus on, you know, looking at what's going on in that storm, and they're right there in the middle of that thing.
Well, I'll just put on the record real quickly. I would do it in a heartbeat. So
I would too.
You jump out of planes.
Yeah,
I would do it in a heartbeat.
I wouldn't jump out of that plane though.
No, I wouldn't recommend it. But it's a very dangerous mission, but it's a very important mission, and I think you know, it's very important to the forecasting side of things as well. You know, both missions, whether it be Air Force or NOAA, provide such an enormous amount of detail in those missions, and then even the output that they give us for the forecasting side of things. But there's two sides of it. There's the planes that fly into the storms, and then the planes that actually fly over the storms. So you have your G4 missions, the Gulfstreams, the nice private Lear jets that fly about 40,000 feet. They fly above the storms, and those help sample the upper atmosphere for steering of the storms. And then you have the
C-130s.
C-130s, and then the P-3s that fly into the storm, which provide those dropsons that they release into the storm to get pressure, wind speed, humidity, temperature, and then all that goes right into the models. So it's very important that those missions actually happen, because those go into the models, and we always know which models have that data. And sometimes you can even see it in that model run. It's like, okay, there's some actual, Hurricane Hunter flight data in this model run. We can kind of trust it a little bit more than maybe one that doesn't really have any data in it, especially those that are out closer to the Central Atlantic.
And it makes it more accurate too, having that data, because sometimes these storms have a mind of their own. If they intensify faster than what the previous run was showing, that changes things. It could change steering, stuff like that. And so it's really important to have that. And I also want to say the Hurricane Center, I believe they've gotten landfall down within a couple of miles. Last year, there were a few crazy forecasts that were so dialed to where that landfall was expected to be, and that saves lives, and that's why their mission's also so important.
Helps people prepare a lot sooner too for those storms moving in. And then when those hurricanes move into the coastal areas around here, more specifically, we end up seeing tornadoes, lots of tornadoes, especially on the coast. But those storms, we watch storms, they're moving across the state, just from west to east, no problem there. Sometimes they'll have some rotation. These storms are born with rotation already going on. I mean, they already have that happening in them, and so we end up with multiple severe storms coming out of hurricanes that are making landfall down on the central coast of Louisiana, or even southeast Texas. They make landfall down there and make their way into the Arctic. Keeps you guys pretty busy during hurricane season.
Yeah, and I think, that was kind of the big thing on everyone's mind as we head into this season, especially anytime we talked about tropical last season. So say we had another storm. The one question that always was on our Facebook pages, we got them from emergency managers, a lot of our core partners at the Weather Service, is this going to be another Beryl? And I think Beryl is an example of the perfect storm, in the sense where the timing, the location, and a lot of other factors that went into Beryl as to why we had as many tornadoes as we had. Just to kind of put it out there again, our office issued 67 tornado warnings in about 8 hours, and then we confirmed about 43 of those. One of those tying the record for one of the longest tropically, I think that's a word, tropical produced tornadoes
in Bossier
on record. Yeah, it was the one that passed just by Barksdale Air Force Base. And it wasn't that long after that one actually got kind of broken. I think it was either Helene or Milton resulted in that in Florida.
Well, that tornado lifted right over Brian's house.
Yeah,
no kidding.
It died at my house.
No kidding.
Yes, there was a tree in the side of the north part of my yard, and this tree had already been hit by one straight line wind occurrence a couple years before. I had just gotten all the mess cleaned up from that because it was just ridiculous. And then here it comes. Here comes that tornado.
We were looking at the data tool, the damage assessment tool, and I was showing him this long track tornado, and he's like, zoom in up there.
Yeah, I said,
he said, that's my
North
yard.
Bossier. Yeah, that looks kind of familiar.
That's my tree.
road. Oh,
wow.
Yeah, that's my tree. That's where they stopped, because the Weather Service, I guess, went out there to do a survey. And it had lifted in North Bossier, and but before it lifted, it made sure it did a lot more damage to that same tree, which is still getting cleaned up, because there's a lot. These are huge trees up in North Bossier.
And that's one of the things with that overall event too, is given the fact that it had passed on Barksdale Air Force Base property, we actually had to get kind of a thumbs up from them to even go out there and survey, because obviously that's one of the big things after these tornado events. And given the fact that we issued 67 tornado warnings, you guys saw all the debris signatures on radar. I've never seen that many debris signatures at one time on one radar scan. It was multiple days of doing surveying after to make sure we got those tracks down. And once we were able to kind of realize that the damage actually moved through part of Barksdale Air Force Base, we were able to link that as one total track instead of two separate tornadoes. Because sometimes, if it goes a certain amount of miles, say it had lifted and it goes a certain amount of miles, we have to identify them as two different tracks, but it just carried as one complete track, and impressive nonetheless. But I think, everyone this season is going to think, okay, we got a storm coming. Is this going to be like Beryl? And I think that's going to be a big question this year.
Yeah, it really will. Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it.
For sure. One more thing. Actually two things. First off, I'm no longer allowed to say quick spin up tornadoes when it comes to talking about tropical systems because of Beryl, because that's what I was the one forecasting the day before. And usually when you get tropical systems moving through that dirty right-hand side, you get quickly spun up tornadoes that don't necessarily last long. It was proved wrong because it went all the way through Bossier Parish, and so that is not a quick spin.
Yeah, it wasn't a quick spin. It was a long spin for sure. It did not want to lift, and then when it did, it said, we'll stop at Brian's house first, and now we're done.
Yeah, he's a meteorologist.
He needs some more work in his yard after getting off work in the afternoons.
Yeah. And then I have to say this because Patrick has taught me well, and I know he will mention this likely when talking about the hurricane outlook. He always says it only takes one storm to make a difference. We could have a crazy number of hurricanes named storms this year, but if they stay out in the Atlantic, then that's really not impactful for us here in the U.S. But if we get just one really bad, really strong Category 5 storm, that changes lives, and that makes it a historic season in a way. And so that's something to definitely pay attention to, think about also as we move through this hurricane season.
Yep, absolutely. Hopefully we can get a Barksdale bubble that covers the coastal areas too.
Yeah.
And the storms will just kind of bounce off of our coast and move back out into the Atlantic.
I like that idea.
Just a giant regional bubble. I think that would work for all of us. I think we'd all agree on that.
Write that down.
Yeah.
All right. I think we're going to wrap this up. Ryan, thanks for chatting with us. I feel like that was super informative just to kind of hear a different perspective. Someone who really enjoys forecasting and hurricane season as a whole.
Hopefully we won't have to deal with it too much this year.
Right.
But in the event that we do, hopefully this was, insightful, and, we'll be pushing out more information through the upcoming season from our office. Obviously, I know you guys are going to be doing that as well. So, it was a great time. I enjoyed talking with you guys.
All right. We'll see you guys again next week.